My name is Mark Walker. I'm 35 years old, a practical man, and I've never been one to believe in ghost stories or the supernatural. But sometimes, something happens that defies all logic, something that changes the way you see the world. For me, that happened the night Rachel and I decided to stay at the Red Pine Motel. We were traveling through the Arizona desert on our way to Santa Fe. It was late, around 11 p.m., and we had been driving for hours. We were starting to feel tired, especially Rachel, who was dozing in the passenger seat. The road was deserted, with no cars or any sign of civilization in sight. The GPS had stopped working some time ago, leaving us to rely on the few worn signs we found along the way. Then we saw one of them. Red Pine Motel, 1 mile. The sign was leaning, almost fallen over, its paint faded with age. I looked at Rachel, who was still sleeping, and sighed. We needed a rest. When the motel came into view, I was surprised. It was exactly what you'd expect from a place in the middle of nowhere. A run-down, worn-down facade with a neon sign flashing erratically. In the parking lot were just 2 old cars, both covered in dust. It didn't exactly look welcoming, but it was our only option. Rachel, wake up. We're here. My voice sounded more tired than I expected. She slowly opened her eyes and looked around the place. Is this the only motel? She asked, frowning. Yes, and honestly, I think it's better than spending the night in the car. The manager was a thin, elderly man with sunken eyes and a smile that seemed more sinister than friendly. He was sitting behind a wooden counter, flipping through a yellowed newspaper. When he saw us, he looked up and gave us a slow nod. Welcome to the Red Pine. We don't get many guests here. Something in his voice made me uneasy, but I didn't want to sound paranoid. He handed us a key to a room on the 2nd floor, number 203, engraved on a plastic key ring. The stairs leading up to the rooms creaked beneath our feet, and the hallway was dimly lit, with occasional flickering lights. When we entered the room, Rachel grimaced. This place is horrible. She wasn't wrong. The carpet had dark stains, and the walls were peeling. There was a faint, musty smell in the air, but we were too exhausted to complain. After showering, I collapsed on the bed, and Rachel did the same. That's when I had the dream. I was running through the hallways of the motel, looking for Rachel. Every door I opened took me back to the same room. I could hear whispers in the distance, indistinct words that seemed to be getting closer. The sound of footsteps echoed behind me, getting closer and closer. Finally, I opened a door and saw Rachel, but something was wrong. Her back was turned, motionless, and when she turned, I realized it wasn't her. I woke up gasping, covered in sweat. I glanced at the clock on the nightstand, 3:15 a.m. Everything was quiet, except for a low sound coming from the door, soft knocking. My heart raced. I lay still, trying to listen better. Rachel was still sleeping next to me, breathing calmly. When the knocking came again, louder this time, I got out of bed, trying to ignore the chill running down my spine. Who's there? I asked, my voice echoing in the room. Silence. I looked through the peephole, but the hallway was empty. I opened the door slowly, only to find the same dimly lit hallway. There was no one there. I went back to the room and locked the door, my heart still pounding. I didn't want to wake Rachel. I convinced myself it was just a normal noise, something related to the old building. But deep down, something told me it wasn't that simple. The next morning, we went down to the small lobby, where the manager was waiting for us with 2 cups of coffee. Did you sleep well? He asked, with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Something in his tone seemed mocking. Before I could answer, Rachel mentioned something strange. Mark, the clock in the room had stopped. It said 3:15. Did you see it? I swallowed hard. I hadn't mentioned anything about the night before, but my uneasiness was growing. As we walked out into the parking lot, I noticed something else. The motel sign now said, "Welcome to the Red Pine Motel," as if we were arriving again. Rachel noticed it first. Mark, was it like this yesterday? I looked around, confused. Something was wrong with this place, but I didn't know what. And deep down, I felt like Red Pine wasn't going to let us leave so easily. We got into the car in silence, Rachel still casting uneasily at the sign that read, "Welcome to the Red Pine Motel." My mind was racing, trying to rationalize what was happening. Maybe we were just too tired. Maybe it was all a coincidence. But the growing unease in the pit of my stomach told me otherwise. "Mark, let's get out of here now, please." I nodded and started the car, the engine roaring in the morning silence. The sun was rising, but even so, the road seemed darker than it should have been. We drove straight for about 5 minutes until something impossible happened. The motel came into view again. I pulled over abruptly, my breathing quickening. Rachel looked at me, her eyes wide. "Did you turn somewhere? Did we go back?" "Number, I didn't turn. It's the same road. This doesn't make sense." I accelerated again, ignoring my growing nervousness. I passed the motel without looking at it and kept driving. This time I glanced at the speedometer. It was showing a steady speed, but when I looked back ahead, the Red Pine Motel was there again. "This is not possible," I yelled, pounding the steering wheel. Rachel began to cry, her sobs filling the cabin. I pulled the car over to the side of the road and took a deep breath, trying to calm my nerves. I decided we needed answers. "Let's talk to the manager. He knows something." Rachel tried to protest, but I had already made up my mind. We got out of the car and walked back to the motel. The sign blinked erratically, and the silence around us was almost deafening. When we entered the lobby, the manager was exactly where we had left him, sitting behind the counter, flipping through that same yellowed newspaper. He watched us with that unsettling smile. "Have you changed your mind about staying here?" "What's going on here?" I demanded, trying to keep my voice steady. "We can't get off this road. This motel keeps popping up. What's up?" The manager tilted his head slightly, as if considering my question. After a moment, he answered with eerie calm, "Oh, you've noticed. Few people do so soon. The Red Pine is no ordinary place, you know. It guards those who enter, and once you're in, you belong to it." Rachel gripped my arm tightly. My mind was spinning, trying to process what he was saying. "This is a joke, right? We're getting out of here, and we're not coming back." He laughed, a low, hollow sound. "You can try, but the Red Pine always finds its way back. It's in its nature. But don't worry, we have all the time in the world." We decided to ignore him and head back to the room. The air felt heavier now, as if the very environment itself was conspiring against us. Rachel began rummaging through the cabinets and drawers, desperate to find something that would help us. That's when we found an old diary under the mattress. The pages were yellowed, and the writings talked about other guests at the motel, names, dates, and then descriptions of how each of them disappeared. The man in room 101 went into the desert and never returned. The woman in room 202 was last seen in the hallway on the second floor. When we reached the last pages, we saw something that made our blood run cold. The diary had already recorded our arrival. "Mark and Rachel Walker, room 203. They still haven't realized they can't leave." Rachel began to sob as she read aloud. I was paralyzed. The clock in the room read 3:15 again, even though it was broad daylight outside. That's when we heard the knocking on the door. This time, it wasn't soft. It was loud and insistent, as if someone or something wanted to get in. I grabbed the nearest chair and propped it against the door while Rachel cowered in the corner of the room. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice shaking. There was no answer, but the knocking continued, getting louder and louder. The chair began to vibrate as if something was about to force its way in. Then everything stopped. Silence returned, but it was even worse. I looked at Rachel, who was still, her eyes fixed on the ceiling. "Mark, the ceiling," she whispered. I looked up and saw the shadow. It was a dark, shapeless figure, slowly descending the walls and crawling toward us. Its red eyes glowed, and a low laugh echoed through the room. "Run, if you can," said a hoarse, cold voice. I grabbed Rachel's hand and we ran out of the room, down the stairs, and through the lobby. The manager just watched us, smiling. When we reached the car, I started the engine and sped off without looking back. The motel disappeared in the rearview mirror, And this time, the road didn't bring us back. But even in safety, the weight of that night never left us. The diary Rachel brought with her still records new names, and sometimes in our nightmares, we hear the knocking at the door. My name is Logan Myers, and I've been driving trucks for over 20 years. I've driven nearly every highway in this country, and I've always considered the open road a safe haven, a refuge from the chaos of the city. I never believed the horror stories other truckers told at rest stops. But that night on Route 66, something happened that changed the way I saw the world forever. I was driving toward Albuquerque with a light load of appliances. The night sky was clear, and the stars seemed to light up the desert around me. The radio was playing soft country music, the kind of music that helped me stay focused. It was around 1 a.m., and the highway was completely deserted. Then I heard a peculiar broadcast on the radio. A deep, drawling voice was telling the story of a 1967 Chevrolet Impala, a classic car that, according to legend, still haunts the roads of Arizona. It was said that it had been involved in a deadly accident decades ago, and that the driver had never been found. Now the car appeared to lone travelers, always at night. "Road legends," I muttered, turning off the radio. I never had patience for such nonsense. I kept driving, the steady roar of the engine filling the cabin. That's when I saw it. A vintage car passed me at an impressive speed, almost knocking me off the road. The wind blew hard against the truck, and for a brief moment, I saw the outline of the vehicle. A 1967 Chevrolet Impala, exactly as described on the radio. Its taillights blinked like red eyes in the darkness. I frowned. Maybe it was just a coincidence. Many vintage cars were still on the road. But something about the sound of the engine bothered me. It wasn't normal. It sounded distorted, almost like a mechanical whine. A few miles down the road, I saw the same car stopped on the shoulder. Its hazard lights flashed, illuminating the side of the road. I slowed down and parked a few feet ahead. I got out of the truck, taking my flashlight with me. The desert around us was quiet, except for the sound of the wind sweeping the sand. "Everything okay in there?" I called, approaching the car. There was no answer. When I shone the light inside the vehicle, my skin crawled. The driver's seat was empty, but the dashboard was covered in thick dust, as if no one had cleaned it in years. An old magazine rested on the passenger seat, the date 1967 printed on the cover. The smell of rust and old oil filled the air. "Anyone there?" I asked again, feeling my heart beat faster. Suddenly the car radio came on, emitting loud static. I took a startled step back, and my flashlight slipped from my hand. Before I could grab it, I heard something that made my blood run cold. A hoarse voice coming from the radio. "He's coming." I ran back to the truck as fast as I could, without looking back. When I got in the cab and turned the key, my engine started immediately, but the radio started to crackle. It sounded like the old car radio. I glanced in the rearview mirror, and my heart sank. The Chevrolet Impala was behind me, its headlights on, glowing like 2 points of fire. It honked, a high-pitched metallic sound that echoed down the road. Without thinking, I stepped on the gas. I sped for miles, trying to outrun the car, but it seemed to be right behind me, always at the same distance. Its horn honked every so often, a reminder that I wasn't alone. I glanced in the rearview mirror again, but this time the car had disappeared. I sighed in relief, slowing down. That's when it appeared again, this time in front of me. Its lights blinded me, and I had to swerve to the side of the road. The truck screeched to a halt, and my breath came in short pants. "What the hell is going on?" I muttered to myself, feeling the sweat drip down my face. The truck's radio turned on by itself, emitting static once more. Between the hissing, I heard another sentence. "You can't escape." My whole body shook. I started the engine again and got back on the road, praying that this was some kind of hallucination. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. Something on Route 66 didn't want me to go any further. And the Chevrolet Impala was just the beginning. The Chevrolet Impala disappeared again. But even as I drove down the deserted highway, the chill in my spine told me I wasn't alone. Route 66, usually comforting in its vastness, now felt alive. The darkness around me seemed to be watching, waiting. I glanced at the clock on the dashboard. 3:15, the same time it had been since it all began. The second hand didn't move. The truck's radio was muted, but still a soft hiss filled the cabin. I knew it wasn't coming from me. My eyes were fixed on the asphalt ahead, trying to ignore the rising panic. That's when I saw it again. The headlights. They appeared on the horizon, small bright spots that grew quickly, illuminating the desert as they approached. The Chevrolet Impala was coming toward me fast as lightning. I slammed on the brakes and swerved to the shoulder, the truck rocking violently. The car sped past me, but instead of continuing down the road, it swerved abruptly, sliding at an impossible angle, and stopped just a few feet from where I was standing. Its headlights went out, leaving only darkness. My breathing was heavy, my hands shaking on the steering wheel. I didn't know what to do. It was as if the road had pulled me into a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. Suddenly, the radio turned on by itself, emitting static loud enough to make me jump. Amid the hiss, a hoarse, cold voice spoke. "You shouldn't be here." I tried to start the engine, but the truck wouldn't respond. I glanced in the rearview mirror, and the Chevrolet was now behind me, its headlights off. I knew something was inside. I could feel it. I took a deep breath, grabbed a flashlight from the console, and opened the door. My boots hit the asphalt, the sound echoing in the oppressive silence. The light from the flashlight trembled in my hands as I approached the car. The desert was so quiet that every step I took sounded like thunder. When I got closer, I saw that the Chevrolet was completely covered in dust, as if it had been abandoned for decades. But the engine was warm. I peered out the window. The driver's seat was empty, but the radio inside the car was also on, emitting the same disturbing static. That's when I saw it. The rear-view mirror reflected something that wasn't in the seat. A faceless figure, just a shapeless shadow with glowing eyes staring straight at me. My flashlight fell to the ground, and the Chevrolet's radio screamed, "Run while you can!" The car door opened with a bang, as if it had been pushed open by an invisible force. The figure began to climb out, its form pulsing like living smoke. I got back to the truck as fast as I could, my shaking hands barely able to hold the key. I turned the engine over, and this time it started. I floored the accelerator hard. The truck sped down the road, and the Chevrolet was soon behind me again, its headlights blazing like two hellish flames. It slammed into the back of the truck repeatedly, each impact stronger than the last. My mind was in a panic. There was nowhere to run, no way to escape. The radio in the cabin came on again. The same voice whispered, this time clearer. "Route 66 never lets anyone go." The Chevrolet sped off, past me, and stopped in the middle of the road. I didn't have time to swerve. I closed my eyes and waited for the impact, but it never came. When I opened my eyes, the Chevrolet had disappeared. The truck was stopped in the middle of a completely different road surrounded by thick fog. The clock on the dashboard now read 0000, as if time had restarted. I got out of the truck, my legs still shaking. The silence around me was absolute. There were no stars, no wind, just the fog and the sound of my own breathing. That's when I heard footsteps. Slow, heavy, coming from behind me. I turned slowly, and there he was, the driver of the Chevrolet Impala. His form was indistinct, but his eyes glowed with a red light that seemed to pierce my soul. He pointed to the truck, and his voice echoed through the fog, full of command. "Your journey ends here." Before I could react, the beam of the Chevrolet's headlights appeared in the distance, heading toward me once more. The last thing I heard was the sound of screeching tires and the driver's hoarse laugh. Days later, other truckers reported seeing my truck abandoned on the side of the road, its engine still warm. But I was never found. They say that on moonless nights, a 1967 Chevrolet Impala still drives along Route 66, and sometimes behind it, an empty truck silently drives. Now I am part of the road, and it never forgets. My name is Ethan Carter, and I've never been one to believe in ghost stories. To me, the world has always been simpler than that. People live, make choices, and eventually die. But there are places that defy logic, places like the house by the Black Well. It all started as a joke between friends. It was the last summer before Lucas left for college, and we wanted to do something memorable. It was his idea, of course. Lucas had always been the fearless one of the group, the one who suggested jumping off bridges or exploring abandoned houses. When he mentioned the house by the Black Well, everyone laughed except Mia. "You're not serious, are you?" she asked, clutching the water bottle in her hands. "Why not?" "It's just an old house. They say there's a well in the basement that never runs dry. I bet it's just a hole somewhere." Mia shook her head, clearly uncomfortable. She was the most superstitious of the group, always talking about energies and scary stories. Derek, the more rational one, shrugged. "And what exactly are we going to get out of this? A bunch of dust on our shoes?" Lucas smiled in a way that only he could. It was impossible not to be carried away by his confidence. And so it was that night, we found ourselves driving down the dirt road that led to the house. The Black Well house sat at the end of a winding drive surrounded by tall, gnarled trees. Even in the moonlight, the house looked devouring. Its windows were broken and the sloping roof looked like it was about to collapse. A sense of unease spread through me as we pulled up. "It's just an old house, guys. Let's go inside before someone gives up." Lucas grabbed his flashlight and led the way. As we stepped inside, the smell of mold and rotting wood overwhelmed us. The floor creaked beneath our feet, and the sound seemed to echo through the entire house. Mia grabbed my arm, her eyes wide. "This doesn't feel right, Ethan. We should go back." "It's just a house, Mia. Lucas is right. Let's take a look and get out." In the foyer, we found a staircase leading upstairs and a door that clearly led to the basement. Lucas pointed to the door with a defiant smile. "I bet the well is down there. Who wants to be first?" No one answered, so he opened the door and started down the steps, his flashlight lighting the way. Reluctantly, we followed behind him. The basement was large, with moss-covered stone walls. In the center was the Black Well. Its rim was made of ancient stone, marked with symbols that none of us recognized. The opening seemed to absorb the light, and the interior was pure darkness. There was no rope, no bucket, just emptiness. "So, this is it? An old hole?" Lucas laughed, picking up a rock from the ground. He threw it into the well, but no sound came. "It must be really deep," Derek suggested, leaning down to take a closer look. "I don't like this," Mia mumbled, backing up against the wall. That's when I heard it for the first time. "Ethan." A low, barely audible voice whispered my name. I looked around expecting to see Lucas or Derek playing some prank, but they were distracted. The sound came again, this time clearer. "Ethan, come on." My throat went dry. I looked down at the well and had the feeling that something was down there, waiting. The darkness seemed to pulse, as if it had a life of its own. I took a deep breath, trying to convince myself that it was just my imagination. "Did you hear that?" I asked, trying to stay calm. "Hear what?" Lucas asked, throwing another rock into the well. "My name, coming from the well." Everyone was silent for a moment. That was when Mia screamed. Her flashlight fell to the ground, and she pointed it at the well with shaking hands. Something is moving in there." We ran toward it, but when we looked down the shaft again, there was nothing but darkness. Even so, the air felt colder, heavier. Derek took Mia's flashlight and shone it down the shaft. "There's nothing here, Mia. You must have imagined it." But I knew it wasn't imagination. Something was there, and it was waiting. When we got back downstairs, we noticed something was different. The windows that had been broken now seemed intact. The air was heavier, almost suffocating. Lucas looked at me, his usual smile finally gone. "I think we should get out of here." I couldn't agree more. But when we opened the front door, there was no exit anymore. Just another dark hallway that shouldn't be there. The hallway shouldn't be there. It was impossible. We were on the ground floor, and the front door had been the entryway. Now, instead, it opened onto a narrow, dimly lit hallway with wooden walls that seemed to close in on us with every step. "What's going on? This doesn't make sense," Mia whimpered, gripping my arm tightly. Let's go back to the basement. There must be another way out, Derek suggested, though his voice was shaking. Lucas shook his head, trying to regain his confidence. He picked up the flashlight and walked down the hallway, ignoring Mia's protests. Maybe it's a prank, something someone set up to scare idiots like us. Let's find out what's going on. Reluctantly, we followed Lucas down the hallway. The light from the flashlight barely illuminated the way, and the silence was almost deafening. Every step made the floor creak, and each creak seemed to echo around us. The shadows on the wall seemed to move, but when we looked, nothing was there. The hallway ended at another door, which Lucas opened without hesitation. When we stepped inside, we realized we were back in the basement. The black pit was there, more sinister than before. The markings on its rim glowed faintly, as if they had been freshly carved. The air was cold, and a low, pulsing sound filled the space. It was as if the pit was breathing. "This isn't real. It can't be real," Mia murmured, her hands covering her face. That's when the voices started. "Lucas, Derek, Ethan, Mia." The sound emerged from the pit, soft but full of malice. The flashlight's lights began to flicker. Lucas approached the pit, staring into the darkness. "Do you hear that? They know our names." His voice was a mix of fear and fascination. "Lucas, get out of there. It's not safe," I shouted, but he didn't hear me. Suddenly, a gust of wind came from the well, throwing dust and pieces of stone into the air. Lucas stumbled back, but not before something came out of the well. It wasn't solid, but it wasn't completely intangible either. It looked like a living shadow writhing in the air, filling the space with a rotten smell. Lucas tried to run, but the shadow grabbed him, wrapping itself around his body. His screams were muffled as he was dragged into the well. The last thing I saw was his terrified face before he disappeared into the darkness. Chaos ensued. Mia ran for the stairs, but as soon as she started up, the steps disintegrated, leaving only an empty hole. She screamed as she fell, disappearing into an abyss that hadn't been there before. Derek and I ran to the opposite wall, but the space seemed to shrink, pushing us back into the well. Derek began mumbling incomprehensibly as if he were in a trance. He turned to me, his eyes glazed over and his expression blank. "The pit wants us all," he said, before calmly walking to the edge and throwing himself in. I was alone. The voices continued, now laughing, whispering secrets I couldn't understand. The pit seemed bigger, deeper, as if it were growing. The shadow returned, this time slowly approaching me. "Number, I won't, I repeated, trying to convince myself. I ran for the door, but it was gone. The space around me was closing in, and the pit was the only thing that remained constant. The shadow was close, and I knew there was no escape. In a final act of desperation, I closed my eyes and screamed. When I opened my eyes, I was lying on the side of the road. The sun was rising, and the house was no longer there. My body was covered in dust, and my throat burned. I struggled to get up, trying to understand what had happened. I went back to town, but no one believed me. Lucas, Mia, and Derek were reported missing. There was no record of the house on any map, and the locals insisted there had never been a house at the end of the road. But I know the truth. I know what I saw. And at night, when I close my eyes, I hear the voices. They haven't left me. Lucas, Mia, and Derek are still there, trapped in the well, and they keep whispering, "Go back to the well, Ethan. Go back to the well."